It was supposed to be a great evening. I was enjoying the sound of the rain outside the window while I sat on the couch in our comfortable living room. Normally noisy and bustling, the house appeared oddly quiet. As teens frequently do, my younger sister Michelle's son, Ethan, had slipped away while she was out to dinner with her friends. The only people left to govern this realm of stillness were me and Sophie, our cuddly ginger cat. I grinned, seeing Sophie stretched like a queen on her throne on the couch. Her eyes were half closed as though to say, "That's right, everything is under control now." This was a unique chance to unwind and simply take in the tranquility. I made the decision to have a hot bath after supper. My favorite way to relax was with steam and warm water, which seemed to relieve all of the day's tension. Sophie chose to go with me as usual, following me languidly to the restroom. She sat down on the threshold and gave me a light-hearted look as though she approved of my plans. When I turned the door lock and made sure it was firmly closed, the tub was already filled with water. Sophie gave me a quick glance that said, "Why do you need this? The house is deserted." Curiosity made her tail quiver, but she quickly lost interest and returned to the living room. I went down in the water. I can feel the warmth permeating every single cell in my body. The water, the steam, the gentle glow of the candles, everything felt so perfect. The rainfall striking the glass was the only sound. I let my thoughts wander far away as my eyes closed on their own. However, the silence was soon broken by an odd sound. Initially, there was a faint squeak, as though someone had stepped softly on the hallway floor. I stiffened and listened intently. Such noises were occasionally produced by the old house, but this one sounded too real. Most likely Sophie, I told myself. She used to enjoy exploring the home, especially when I wasn't looking. I kept taking pleasure in the water, but after a little while, I heard another sound. This time, there was movement instead than just a creak, as if someone were approaching the door cautiously. A shiver went through my body. But don't be dumb, I told myself hastily. I was tense for some reason, even though it was just the old floors. I glanced toward the door. A shadow developed where the thin line of light beneath it had appeared to be motionless. After crossing the light for a moment, it froze. My heart pounded. On the other side, I could hear faint breathing. Slow. Rhythmic. Too near. Who is present? My voice was not as steady as I had intended, but it was louder than I had anticipated. Nothing happened for a few seconds, and I started to believe I had made it all up. Then a voice that was familiar entered. Ethan was the one. "I apologize, I was unaware of your presence. Aunt Claire." His tone was one of embarrassment and his sentences were tentative. I let out a breath of relief, yet there was something unsettling about his voice. His voice wasn't his own. I tried to speak lightly and softly. "I'll be out soon, Ethan." "It's okay." The footsteps behind the door backed up a second later. The silence came again, but it was no longer comfortable. I couldn't understand the peculiar residue that was left behind by that brief contact. Sophie looked at me curiously at the door when I came out of the toilet, as though to ask, "Something happened, didn't it?" Convinced that it was merely a coincidence, I stroked her smooth fur while listening to the quiet in the house. But there was still a sliver of discomfort. I awoke the following morning to the gentle tapping of Sophie's claws on the hardwood floor. Sunlight slowly made its way through the curtain gaps into the chilly room. I attempted to ignore the nasty aftertaste of the previous evening by concentrating on my regular morning routine. Ethan was seated at the table with a cup of coffee that he had apparently made too strong when I went down to the kitchen. His face revealed it. He was usually brisk in the mornings, but today he moved slowly. When I walked in, he didn't even look up. I said, attempting to seem upbeat, good morning," he said quickly, avoiding eye contact. Sophie was sitting on a chair as usual, watching us closely. She seemed to sense the tension in the room as her tail gently moved back and forth. Sitting across from Ethan, I picked up a cup and poured myself some coffee. Sophie leaped onto my lap right away. She seemed to be attempting to reassure me by placing her gentle paws on my pajamas. The only sound to disturb us while we sat there was the wall clock ticking away. He was staring intently into his cup, obviously avoiding eye contact while I tried to come up with anything to say to start a discussion. "Did you return late yesterday evening?" In an attempt to sound as informal as possible, I finally inquired. He said, "Yeah." A little late, he looked up at last, a trace of discomfort on his face, as though he thought I would say more. However, I said nothing. I couldn't understand why a silent, imperceptible wall had appeared between us, and everything felt weird. Sophie purred as she curled up on my lap, but the tension persisted despite her presence. Ethan sprang to his feet suddenly. He grumbled as he hurried out of the kitchen, "I have to work on a project for school." As he ascended the stairs, his footsteps reverberated throughout the home. I was abandoned. Sophie leaped off my lap and trailed after him, perhaps intrigued by his actions. As I watched them leave, My own misgivings grew stronger by the minute. The day went on and on. I kept myself busy by cleaning, checking my emails and reading novels, but I was unable to focus. My mind continued racing with questions. Why was last night's situation still bothering me? Why did Ethan make me feel so weird? For his own part, it was rare for him to leave his room so little. I made the decision to prepare dinner by evening. I tried to restore some semblance of normalcy to the day. Sophie burst into the kitchen and leaped onto the table when I was chopping veggies. She seemed to be anticipating someone because her gaze was focused on the doorway. A few minutes later, Ethan came in with a controlled smile. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, as if reluctant to approach. In an attempt to break the awkward quiet, he replied, "Smells good, I thought we could have dinner together," I said. He sat at the table and watched me finish cooking after nodding. As soon as I brought the meal, we began to eat and discuss unimportant topics like work, school, and Michelle's plans. The tension seemed to be easing, and the conversation became more organic with time. However, he abruptly approached me while I was clearing the plates after supper. My heart began to race. "Claire, Aunt." His voice trailed off as he started softly. Startled by how close he was, I turned to face him. He leaned in a little at that point. He moved slowly, almost inquiringly, as though seeking confirmation. Only a second passed. My cheeks flushed as we locked eyes and I backed off a little. "Apologies," said, backing up swiftly. A glimmer of shame appeared in his eyes and he rushed up the stairs. As I stood there, I tried to take in the situation. Sophie narrowed her eyes at me and twitched her tail as though she didn't like us both. My sense that something was changing, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it, was only intensified by the day. Silently, night fell, as though the cosmos itself had chosen to allow me some time to think. Once more, the only sound in the house was Sophie's gentle purring as she sat on my lap. In my room, I was sitting there looking at a book that had been open to the same page for 30 minutes. However, I was unable to concentrate since the letters appeared to dance before my eyes. My mind kept returning to the nighttime. What had brought Ethan thus close? Why was I unable to dismiss it as a typical awkward teenage moment? There had been a change between us, and I was unsure of how to respond. Sophie's claws tapped softly on the floor as she suddenly sprung to her feet and trotted toward the entrance. I glanced at her, a little taken aback by her abrupt motion. Ethan emerged in the doorway as the door slowly opened. His expression was solemn but tight, as though he wasn't sure if he should go inside. "Can we have a conversation?" After a little silence, he asked, his voice almost audible above a whisper. I closed the book gently and put it away after nodding. With no intention of leaving, he leaped back onto the bed. She seemed to be paying close attention to what was going on as her tail swayed slowly back and forth. Ethan took a few steps away from me and stepped in, shutting the door behind him. As like he was having trouble finding the perfect words, his eyes strayed about the room but kept coming back to me. He started out by saying, "I wanted to apologize for tonight." His tone was low and almost contrite. "I didn't mean for it to come across as strange," I said, attempting to sound light-hearted. "It's okay, Ethan, these things do occur occasionally." My remarks didn't seem to assist, but we simply misinterpreted one another a little. His expression was still tense. His shoulders slumped as though he had lost a struggle with his emotions. And he sat on the side of the bed. He avoided looking at me and replied, "I just feel like everything's different since I came back home. I feel as though I'm trying to figure out where I belong, but I'm not sure how." I was moved by what he said. I had never thought about how difficult his age may be, particularly in a household where people are often comparing you to other people. Despite my sympathies, I was unable to overlook the tension that still existed between us. I whispered to Ethan, "I know it's difficult, but sometimes these are just moments each of us copes in a different way." When he looked up, a mixture of hesitation and thankfulness was visible in his eyes. He moved slowly, as though he didn't want to upset the delicate equilibrium. I could feel the room's air become substantially heavier as he drew closer. "You're always so kind to me," he whispered. His words were unexpectedly sincere, and I saw him struggling with himself, as though trying to decide what to say next. For a moment, the silence between us became almost tangible, and before I could say anything, he leaned in closer. His visage was so close that I could feel the warmth in his voice. Everything happened too fast. He touched my cheek with his lips, softly, almost weightlessly. This was not intended to be offensive. Instead, it was an act of appreciation combined with an effort to convey what he was unable to articulate. But my heart was pounding even in this fleeting instant. I stared him in the eyes as I slowly withdrew, putting all the warmth I could into the motion. "Let's simply remain ourselves, Ethan." After a moment of hesitation, he nodded and his face softened. He got up and glanced at Sophie, who appeared to be observing everything with shrewd comprehension. "Thank you, Claire," he muttered softly before heading out. I could feel the tension start to ease as the door shut behind him. As though to reassure everyone that everything was well, Sophie purred sweetly. However, I was aware that this night would have an impact on our story, even if it was a minor one. The start of the morning was abnormally quiet. I lay in bed for a few minutes, observing the rays of light coming through the curtains, after waking up earlier than usual. Sophie was cuddled up next to me, her smooth breaths causing her fluffy side to rise and fall in time. I experienced a weird spectrum of feelings in that silence, including relief, remorse, and worry. The past few days were too recent in memory. I realized that. Ethan's demeanor, the conversations we had, and his acts were all planned. But what should we do with this information? I had nothing to say. Ethan was already in the kitchen when I descended. He stood by the sink and gazed intently out the window. He hadn't even acknowledged me, it seems. I tried to catch his attention by clearing my throat. I tried to sound informal as I said, "Good morning." His eyes were gentle but wary as he turned. "Good morning," he said. There was a tension in the air, but not the awkward type, as though the words were spoken with some effort. It was more of a pause that made us both consider carefully what we should say or do next. "Would you want a cup of coffee?" I said, as I made my way to the coffee machine. It was my attempt to diffuse the tension and restore the normalcy that had been absent for the past several days. He sat down at the table and said, "Yes, thank you." We sat across from one another and spoke briefly about the weather and our plans for the day, but we both knew it was a front. At last, he inhaled deeply and turned to face me. "I want you to know, Claire," he said, "I'm thankful for everything," in an honest but slightly tight tone, "for always being there, for understanding me." His remarks moved me, even when I don't understand myself. Emotions might be so strong at his age that they are difficult to communicate. I grinned as the cornerstone of our relationship, that subtle warmth returned between us. "I just want you to be content, Ethan." I looked into his eyes and said, "We'll overcome the challenges that life throws at us." Sometimes his eyes grew a little softer. He turned his cup in his hands absently and averted his gaze. I thought for a second that he was going to say anything, but he simply got up. "I must take a walk," he whispered. He left the kitchen after I nodded, leaving me to think alone. By evening, there was silence in the house once more. Ethan said he might be late since he had gone out to meet friends, and Michelle was still at work. I was sitting in the living room, holding a cup of tea while covered with a blanket. As usual, Sophie was close by, her amber eyes intently observing me, as though she were aware of every emotion I was experiencing. I attempted reading, but my mind was elsewhere. I learned from my talk with Ethan that morning that he sensed the change between us, but like me, was unsure of how to respond to it. I looked out the window and closed the book within. I heard the front door open after a few minutes. Ethan had returned. He walked lightly, almost silently, as though he didn't want to wake me. "You return early." I took note of his appearance in the living room doorway. "Yes," he said. He made the decision to return home. He approached the chair across from me, sat down, and lowered his gaze as his speech had an odd softness. We just sat quietly, as if we didn't want to disturb this delicate moment. At last he turned to face me, and I could see the same appreciation I had heard earlier in the day in his eyes. Now, however, there was a fresh resolve. He said, "I know it's sometimes hard to know how to act, especially when everything seems confusing, but I want you to know that you're important to me." And I nodded and smiled. "Thank you, Ethan." His words were straightforward, but they conveyed all the information I needed to hear. "We'll get through this, right? That means more to me than you would think." He leaned forward, putting his elbows on his knees, and spoke softly. "Yes," I answered. I felt as though the tension between us had finally subsided and that clarity had taken its place. Once more. The quiet was one of solace rather than fear. For the first time in a long time, I thought everything might be all right when Sophie jumped gently onto Ethan's lap.